So why don't we do some of our commentary on what's been going on in the country? And, I'm actually shocked that more people aren't focusing on why our local police departments are militarized and what we can do to prevent it. And honestly, all of the proposals I've seen from members of Congress have been quick fixes to a problem that has led to symptoms, and they want to just deal with the symptoms. You got to deal with the root of the problem. So let's discuss it a little bit. So there's been a lot of talk about reforming the police, defunding the police, and these discussions are important. They need to happen. But one thing that I think most Americans can agree on is that if you look at the type of policing that's taking place during these protests, the type of weaponry that's used, the type of supplies that local police departments have at their disposal look very similar to the type of weaponry that's used by the military abroad. And, I think a lot of Americans have turned a blind eye to the actions of our government abroad and how we've been terrorizing Black and brown people in various countries throughout the world for a long time now. And that has had a boomerang effect. And the incentive structure to engage in these wars has now led to weapons and all sorts of military material coming back to our own country and being used against us. And it's being done by a program that started decades ago known as the Pentagon Program 1033. And what it does is it takes surplus from the military, and that includes tanks, grenade launchers, all sorts of weaponry, and basically invests it back into local police departments. Now, local police departments don't have to pay for it. It's like a donation program, essentially. But we, the U.S. taxpayers, do pay for it by funding the wars that we engage in abroad. And these wars have, of course, made weapons manufacturers and private military contractors a ton of money. So I want to talk a little bit more about what 1033 is, and then kind of walk you through how this has negatively impacted policing in America, and how it's just not enough to simply say, we're going to stop transferring these weapons to local police departments. We need to deal with U.S. foreign policy as well, because if you see what's going on throughout the country and you believe that it's unconscionable, good, you should believe it's unconscionable. You should feel that way. But consider the fact that our actions towards civilians abroad are actually much worse and much more vicious, violent, and dangerous. So I think Vox had a very good summary of what the program is. The 1033 program's roots lie in the drug war and was originally created in 1990 as part of the National Defense Authorization Act, which authorized the Pentagon to transfer military equipment to local law enforcement if it was, quote, suitable for the use in counter-drug activities. In the wake of September 11th, of course, the program's focus has expanded to include counter-terrorism activities as well. So again, our foreign policy, the way that we were manipulated, honestly, after 9/11 has had such a negative impact on local law enforcement, and civilian policing has looked more like we're constantly at war with police, and it shouldn't be that way. So there was this great tweet that really sparked my interest. It's by a professor from the University of Chicago, and his name's Paul Post, and he says the following. Did Iraq and Afghanistan wars contribute to the militarization of U.S. police departments? Data are pretty clear. Surplus military equipment transferred to local law enforcement via 1033 programs steadily rose starting in the mid-2000s, followed by spikes in 2010, right? So you can see in that graph that you see the military weaponry really shooting up when it, no pun intended, by the way, toward local law enforcement in the United States, because there's a surplus, right? Raytheon needs an incentive to keep making these weapons. Lockheed Martin has an incentive to keep making this military weaponry, tanks, all of the supplies that we see being used abroad. And then the Pentagon ends up with a surplus. What do they do with the surplus? Where do they take it? they take it to the local law enforcement. And that's what you see in the graph that I just showed you. Now, it also ends up in government agencies where you would think, hey, they have no business with any type of weaponry, much less military grade weaponry. So for instance, the Parks Division of Delaware's Department of Natural Resources was given 20 M16 rifles, while the Fish and Wildlife Enforcement Division obtained another 20 M16s, plus 8 M14 rifles and 10 .45 caliber automatic pistols. You know, because when you're protecting wildlife, things get rough, and you got to make sure you got all those guns and all that weaponry to keep the fish safe. Also, when you look at Rhode Island, police in Johnston, Rhode Island, with a population of less than 29,000 people, acquired 2 bomb disposal robots, 10 tactical trucks, 35 assault rifles, more than 100 infrared gun sights, and 2 pairs of footwear designed to protect against explosive mines. The Johnson Police Department has 67 sworn officers. So just do the math. The amount of weaponry versus the number of people living in that area and the number of cops in that area. More than $5 billion in surplus equipment has been distributed to law enforcement agencies nationwide, including school police, fun, between 1997 and 2014. So look, the program 1033 was scaled back by the Obama administration. But there's a problem with relying on that method of political activism, because what happened when Trump got elected? Well, in 2017, he revived it. And of course, this incentive structure continues. These weapons manufacturers continue making their weapons. We keep engaging in needless wars across the world. And we end up with the unending, never-ending supply of weaponry. So I also want to just quickly talk about what's being proposed, because right now we have various members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans in some cases like Rand Paul, who are arguing, okay, we just need to end the transfer, right? No more transferring weapons from the Pentagon to local police departments or schools or any of that. But the issue with that proposal is that we still end up with a surplus of weapons, because Raytheon and Lockheed Martin are still going to make them. We're still going to engage in these wars that we should not engage in. And where do those weapons end up? I fear that they're going to end up being sold, and we're already doing some of this now. They're going to be sold to other countries. And we're just going to pump more and more weapons around the world, which makes things less safe, less stable, and it really doesn't deal with the root of the problem. And how much of an incentive do these private defense contractors have when it comes to engaging in these wars? Well, there's a great study done by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And if you look at Lockheed Martin specifically, arms sales account for 88% of their revenue. And for Raytheon, it's 94%. So they're going to keep lobbying. They're going to keep pushing us toward more of these endless wars, toward more of these conflicts that we do not need to engage in, because they're looking out for their bottom line. And honestly, the stage was already set for this type of program to infiltrate our local police departments, because the culture within our local police departments were already problematic, to say the least. In fact, the culture really started changing in Los Angeles during the so-called Watts riots. So this was in 1965, and that was the first time that the concept of SWAT teams came up. So there was a guy named John G. Nelson. He was a Marine who basically said, you know what, these riots were scary and serious, and so maybe we need to have, a tactical solution to it. And that was when SWAT was first proposed. And then in the 1990s, that's when it was actually really implemented in the Los Angeles Police Department. And it was glorified, really, in all sorts of propaganda, including in video games. So there's one video game known as Police Quest. And I just want to show you what the commercials look like.
Meet the men and women who risk their lives daily in the most violent city in the nation. LA's SWAT specialists.
We are a life-saving organization, and that's what we do most of the time. We use all of our tactics and all of our training to resolve a situation without hurting anyone. but sometimes there's no way around that, and when that happens, it's a suspect that he decides the way it's going to end.
Learn their tactical maneuvers. Witness their instinct for sensing danger. Follow their daring adventures in Police Quest 5, LAPD SWAT.
And by the way, Jacobin does so much, so many important talks and work, and they're actually going to have a talk about the Watts riots on Monday. So make sure you check that out. It's excellent. Everything that I've seen with these talks have been excellent. So just to get more in-depth information about what happened during the Watts riots, make sure you check that out. But just going back to that culture that really started in the LAPD, the police chief who pushed for the formation of SWAT was a police chief who actually ended up retiring after the Rodney King riots in the 1990s. His name was Daryl Gates. And just check out this braggy video where he was talking about forming SWAT. Take a look.
The acronym SWAT stands for Special Weapons and Tactics. When we originally came up with the acronym SWAT, it was going to be Special Weapons Attack Teams. And that was my acronym. And someone wiser than I was said, no, you can't say attack. And when I thought about it, I thought, you're right. That is not what we want to project with SWAT.
But that is exactly what they project with SWAT. So I just find it interesting because I think the way that Gates wanted to use the acronym was the honest truth. I think that's the way that he viewed SWAT. And then he was told to, maybe rein in the language a little bit. But my point is that the culture was there already. And what the federal government did with the Pentagon program is essentially empower that vicious ideology where police aren't there to keep us safe. Police are there to see us as enemy combatants, as a threat, as individuals that need to, be controlled through violent means. And that's why we need to not only end the Pentagon 1033 program, but really rethink our foreign policy and reconsider the apathy that I think this country has been engaged in when it comes to our actions abroad. Because again, if we're disgusted with the way protesters are being treated in this country right now, we need to consider how civilians are being treated abroad, because we've been maiming Black and brown people for a long time now. And we need to consider that. We need to speak out and fight against that. And unless we change that system, we're not going to see better treatment of Americans here.
That's awesome. I completely agree with everything you said. And that footage from the video game ad was just incredible. And another thing to look at is the really direct relationship between the Pentagon, the intelligence community, police departments, and Hollywood and video games, and really the very direct propagandistic relationship between those industries and, just broadly speaking, say the national security state. And yeah, there's no way of separating materially, and even things like in the beginning couple days of the protests, when you would see certain police departments very consciously, doing these bizarre videos like dancing with the protesters or doing kneels to try to neutralize some of what was happening. And then, of course, the videos emerged of occupying U.S. forces in Iraq and Afghanistan using exactly the same tactics as occupying armies. So these relationships are deep, of course, like on the material level with the literal artillery, but the overall structure of like what drives our foreign policy and how this stuff gets spread in culture. So awesome. I love it. And that Daryl Gates clip is, that's, they had to get the PR shop in to be like, Daryl,
oh my gosh,
what it is.
He was horrible. Like, I've been reading about him a lot, and during the Rodney King protests and riots, just going back to what you said earlier, Michael, the LAPD absolutely allowed the looting to happen. That was not an accident. The looting was taking place for hours before the LAPD responded at all. And so that was part of the reason why he retired immediately after that. It was just such a disgusting, act by the LAPD, and unfortunately, and I think we're going to talk about this more throughout the show, rather than use that as an opportunity to better the system, I think that things just further devolved, and we saw more and more military-grade weapons sent to local police departments throughout the country.
Yeah, exactly. That was fantastic. I hope everybody will follow up on every aspect of what you outlined there.